Welcome. We are the Mental Barbell, your go-to resource for everything mental performance. We're here to talk about sports, psychology, and everything in between. Welcome to the ultimate mental performance journey. Welcome to the Mental Barbell. My name is Ian Reardon, and I'm joined today by Dr. Jim Reardon, a nationally acclaimed sports psychologist who also just happens to be my father. Dr. Reardon brings over 35 years of experience helping athletes mentally perform at their best. He's worked at virtually every level of sport, from Olympic and professional teams to collegiate and high school athletics. His clients have included the New York Jets, the Columbus Blue Jackets, USA Track and Field, and the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, to just name a few. Dr. Reardon holds a PhD in clinical psychology from The Ohio State University, along with master's degrees in both counseling psychology and exercise physiology. His multidisciplinary expertise has made him a trusted resource for athletes across a wide range of sports, including football, hockey, track and field, wrestling, and gymnastics. And as a fun fact, he once clean and jerked 387 pounds in competition. Please welcome to the show my dad, Dr. Jim Reardon. Hi, Dad. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Ian?
I'm doing very well. Been enjoying a lot of the championship sports as some seasons has been wrapping up, which we'll get to in a little bit here. Um, but as our show kind of is structured here, the way we like to start off is talking about some current research in the field of sports psychology and get some of our opinions on the findings of those studies. We like to talk about some current sports psychology in the news, especially with the French Open and then the Stanley Cup playoffs here coming up. So to kick things off, I'd love to get your kind of opinions on this research study that just came out in came out of China this past winter in 2025. The researchers of Wen, He, Li, and Hu. The title of this research article was "Optimizing Light Environments in Aquatics Centers to Enhance the Performance of Olympic Champions and Other Elite Swimmers." So fascinating study. What these researchers did was take 14 elite athletes. So this was across the Chinese national teams and other elite university programs. And they had them swim in two different lit environments. The first environment was more of a traditional kind of broad spectrum light. They called it the common correlated color temperature was the scale they used here. So a typical kind of normal broad scale light in the aquatics facilities for the control group, and then the experimental condition they used more of a blue lit pool, or they lit the pool in more of blue light. And so what they had these athletes do was a 15-meter sprint off the blocks. They timed that 15-meter sprint. They tested all kinds of things like reaction time, visual fatigue, emotional states, and things like that to see what the light actually did to those athletes. Some really interesting findings. I'll just read a quote here from the research article, and this kind of outlines everything that they found. But the neurobehavioral, and this is a quote here, the neurobehavioral and swimming tests showed that Olympic champions and other elite swimmers had significantly faster responses, fewer lapses, greater arousal levels, and less visual fatigue, and quicker reactions at the start, and higher swimming speeds in the experimental condition compared to the control condition. So again, that means they were off the blocks faster, so they reacted to a starter faster. They were swimming 215 meters faster, and then on some of their other psychomotor skills, they also showed lower visual fatigue. And I think the really important thing to note is that it did not change the mood of the athletes. A lot of times that blue light is more associated with irritation and kind of agitation, but they did not find that that was the case in this study. So really interesting study, just kind of illuminating the pun intended there, illuminating the different factors that can go into performance, right? So things like the way that the venue is lit can really have a significant impact on that performance. And so, given your wealth of experience in the sports psych field, how does something like that kind of strike you?
I think it's a very interesting study and a very interesting result, having spent literally hundreds or thousands of hours in aquatic centers watching you and your brother and sisters swim. I can attest to the fact that probably better lighting or brighter lighting certainly would possibly affect the individual's mood and maybe their performance as well. So I thought the fact that they used high level and Olympic caliber athletes, I think is notable because the vast majority of sports psych research is done on athletes competing at a much lower level. So I think the fact that they had Olympic level or national level swimmers as the subjects certainly makes the results even more interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's limited the field a little bit. A lot of the research is done on, psychology undergraduate students who are relatively untrained. So to see a really high level population is great. One thing that I noticed in this also is that it was published in more of a architecture, like building design publication, a journal more dedicated to building and the architecture of these sports venues. So I think it's interesting and kind of necessary to look at those outside sources, not just the sports psychology journals, but some of those other journals that have some psychology implications. So, as always, we keep our eyes on recent publications and things that are kind of constantly evolving in the field, and that was certainly an interesting one. Our next segment here is we always like to keep an eye on the news and see when sports psychology topics and considerations are talked about on the news or when they pop up in articles. And I think, given that the French Open just concluded a few weeks ago, there were some really interesting things that popped up that I noticed that I'd love to get your opinion on. And the first was some of the struggles and obstacles that Naomi Osaka has been kind of going through this season, kind of this past 6 months. She took a break from the sport for a little bit, and cited, especially she exited, unfortunately, the French Open early as well, citing a lot of anxiety and a little bit of burnout with the sport. In the Yahoo Sports article that I read, she talks about really feeling pressure that she let her coach down. And I think that's, a very common experience with athletes, is letting, that feeling of pressure of not letting your parents down or your coaches down or the people that come to support you. So I thought it was good that she's being open and kind of showing that even at the top level of sports, those struggles are very real. So, if you were working with an athlete that is kind of struggling with that pressure and that's leading to some burnout issues, do you have any recommendations or things that you would kind of talk to them through or talk them through?
I think that the most important aspect of addressing that would probably be to encourage them or help them gain some skills to focus more on the process of what they're doing instead of how they're doing.
Mhm.
I mean, I think the problem, I mean, the goal is to perform at a high level. And so how you're doing is obviously very relevant. But the reality is that the best way to do well isn't to focus on how you're doing, but to focus on what you're doing, to focus on the process, to trust your training, and to kind of stay in the moment rather than, thinking about potential failure or even thinking about potential success.
Yeah, absolutely. So process-oriented thinking can get rid of a little bit of that pressure. I also thought it was interesting that, and I'm sure if you talk to her coach, he doesn't feel like she's letting him down or letting them down at all, right? It's a feeling that is created by the athlete more often than is a real fact of the situation they're in. The pressure that athletes put on themselves is often, somewhat created in their mind, or at least made to be bigger than it might be in their mind. So I definitely think being able to put that pressure into perspective and maybe talking to some of those people that you feel like you're letting down and realizing that they love you no matter what, they're going to continue to support you no matter what. So open communication and trying to handle and put into perspective that pressure. Kind of on the other side of that, with the French Open, we also saw Coco Gauff winning the French Open and citing some different techniques that I know I've used with athletes. And the thing that stuck out the most to me, was her attempt to build her confidence before those outcomes happened, right? So a lot of times athletes think they have to stack up a bunch of wins to then be confident. And what I think you saw with Coco Gauff there is that she worked to build the confidence before she even stepped out onto the court. So one of the things she talked about doing was writing down, I will be French Open champion 2025 over and over on a piece of paper, and she kept that with her on the court. So with that story, it kind of shows that the pressure can either make or break an athlete, even within the same sport. So it's a lot of how you handle that pressure that can determine how things go for you. So, did you have any thoughts about Coco Gauff's her positive affirmations or any of the techniques she used to help build confidence?
I mean, certainly those kinds of thoughts are going to create a better atmosphere within her in which to perform. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, hopefully, several things. First of all, if you have that positive focus, it negates the potential or diminishes the potential for negative focus, for what ifs, for worries about maybe some kind of adverse situation or mistakes early in a contest. I mean, the reality is a tennis match is composed of literally hundreds of different points. And in one respect, every point matters the same, but in other respects, certain points can either set a positive climate or potentially set a negative mental climate, depending on the ability of the person to and the preparation of the person to handle that kind of situation. And it seems as though Coco Gauff, probably practiced both ends of that spectrum.
Mm. Yeah, and I like the idea of kind of filling the void of your mind with those positive affirmations, because that's, in my experience, when the negative thinking and negative self-talk starts to bubble up, is when you're not actively thinking about anything and you're just letting your mind kind of wander and drift. I also think we all live in kind of two futures. We create, the best case scenario or the worst case scenario in our mind, and how much time you spend thinking about each of those futures will determine which one comes true, right? So for her, I will be French Open champion. That was the future that she was choosing to pay attention to, rather than any of the less positive outcomes that could have happened. So those two stories, and kind of watching the French Open from afar, shows how the same or a similar experience, a similar level of pressure, stress, and confidence can make or break an athlete. And I think it does come down sometimes to those mental skills, and if we're you know spending time actively pursuing them. Another news story, obviously, that I think is near and dear to both of our hearts here with hockey is the Panthers winning the Stanley Cup here for a repeat year. This was a story that came out of kind of earlier games. It came out before they had finally won the cup. But it was talking about the kind of the superstition of the team. And I know you have a different read on it, so I'll give you kind of my read first. And that was when the Florida Panthers won the conference trophy, the Prince of Wales trophy. They didn't touch the cup as they did last year, so they did not touch this conference trophy either of the 2 years that they won it, and then they went on to win the Stanley Cup both of those years. So I thought it was a really interesting kind of peek into the superstition of those high level athletes, those elite athletes. Um, you know, whether it be something that they were told by older players, or I know there's some superstition around the actual Stanley Cup and touching it before you win it. But maybe you could give some of your perspective. I know you have more of an inside look on kind of what the team is doing and thinking, but I thought it was interesting from the superstitions point of view. I'm curious to see what you thought.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it is interesting from the superstition point of view, but I think that my take on it is that it's what underlies the superstition that really is more important, and what the dynamics were that influenced, the behavior 3 years ago when they won the Eastern Conference for the first time. Um, I mean, clearly, this was a team that hadn't won a playoff series in 25 years, and all of a sudden they won one in 22, I believe it was, or 20, and then 23 they won the Eastern Conference Championships for the first time, and I mean, you could see the exuberance on the faces of the players when they won that Eastern Conference championship and were presented with the Prince of Wales trophy. I mean, they couldn't wait to embrace it and pick it up and have pictures taken. And this is in 2023. And it was for them, without realizing it, at least the biggest step they had ever taken in that process in the history of the franchise. Obviously, they went on to lose the Stanley Cup championship that year to the Las Vegas Golden Knights in 5 games. The next year, they again won the Eastern Conference championship. They did not touch the Prince of Wales trophy. There was not, if you could put the two quote unquote celebrations on screens next to each other. It wasn't that they weren't happy that they won in 24. They were, but it was clear that winning that conference championship was not the goal. That the goal, after having won a conference championship, having gone to a Stanley Cup final, having lost to the Vegas Golden Knights, the goal clearly was win the Stanley Cup. And so there was not the same sense of exuberance. There was more in 24. And again, this year in 25, there was more of a, all right, this is one step in the process, but this is not the ultimate goal. And so they didn't touch the trophy, the Prince of Wales trophy in 24. Again, they didn't touch it this year because clearly winning the Stanley Cup in 24, which they did, beating Edmonton Oilers in 7 games, and then winning the Stanley Cup again this year, again beating the Edmonton Oilers in 6 games, was clearly the goal.
Mm. Yeah, I think you put it great there that it's not necessarily the behavior that's important, but it's about what the behavior or what gave rise to the behavior, which for you,
Right,
uh, what you're saying is it's almost like they didn't have the vision to see what was beyond the conference trophy, right? And in that lack of vision might have impacted the way they played in those
right.
playoff games.
I
So
mean, in 23, they had never been there. They had accomplished more in 23 than the team had accomplished in the history of the organization. And
sure.
so there were things to be celebrated. Unfortunately, that was not the ultimate celebration.
Yeah.
And I think, clearly there are many, many factors that were much more important in the success of that franchise, the success of those players, than whether or not they touched the Prince of Wales trophy. But I think what it potentially represented was a significant shift in what their focus was.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think going into the 25-26 season, I mean, my understanding, my impression, based on what I watched in terms of the team celebrating and what I heard from interviews and what I know from several of the players that I know fairly well from that team, is that they are just as focused on winning next year as they were on winning this year and in 2024.
Wow. Okay. Well, it sets a stage for next season. We'll see where they go.
Yep.
Um, Absolutely, and I think it reminds me of the Kobe Bryant quote, or in his interview, right? It was one of the playoff games. I'm not sure what game it was, but they asked him, are you happy with the win? And he just said, job's not done yet, right? Job's not finished. So I think it's helpful to say to athletes, right? Even if you achieve that goal, right? There is something next. There can be something next. So um,
Right.
I appreciate your perspective on those stories. And one of the core ethos here at the Mental Barbell is the idea that iron sharpens iron. And I'd love to, given your very illustrious career in sports psychology, I'd love to have the chance to kind of pick your brain about your experience in the field, how you got started, and maybe some things that you've learned along the way. So, um, you've worked with some tremendous teams. You've worked in the Olympic Committee. You've worked in professional football in the NHL, a little bit in the MLB. But can you take us back to maybe the start of Dr. Jim Reardon in the field of sports psychology? How did you get into the field? And what started your journey?
I mean, it's interesting looking back, and the interesting thing for me is that my journey in sports psychology really had its origin in my own failure. And not as a sports psychologist, although I've, like anyone, I've had ups and downs with regard to that process and the people I've worked with. But after I got my license as a psychologist, this is in 1977. I actually didn't turn my interest to sports psychology at that point in 78 and 79. I actually began to train again as an athlete, and I was a discus thrower in college, and for a couple of years after my undergraduate, and then basically I took a bunch of years off, more than 10 years off from training and competing while I was, working, and then while I was doing my PhD studies at Ohio State. And so once I graduated, I really was more interested in trying to see where I might have gone had I continued to train after my undergraduate and a couple of years that I competed after undergraduate. And so by that time, I was in my early 30s and started training again as a discus thrower, both training technique and strength and conditioning and a lot of lifting, including Olympic lifting, which I not only used for training but also competed in Olympic lifting competitions. Um, and so but the thing that really sold me on the need for sports psychology was after having trained for a couple of years and feeling like I was at a place where I could compete, having had some success, I went to a fairly significant, not the most significant, but a fairly significant national meet called the United States Track and Field Federation National Championships. And I went there feeling like I was physically ready. What I didn't realize is that I wasn't mentally ready. And so, in a competition like that, in the preliminary rounds, all the competitors receive three throws. And on my first throw, it was one that may have gotten me into the finals in that competition, but I fouled. And so there was no result from that throw.
Hmm.
The second throw, I didn't realize it, but I was overly careful um, um, to make sure I didn't foul. And I didn't foul, but I pulled the discus far to the right. And that throw, which was not nearly as good, went out of bounds. And
Hmm.
so again, it's a no mark. And so at that point, again, not realizing and certainly not preparing myself for that particular situation, I didn't realize it, but I was basically toast going into that third round.
Hmm.
And the third round, the throw was not good. I again fouled it. And so I basically completely bombed out of that competition. And that would have been probably around 1979, 1980. And so I was 33 years old at that age.
And
And that's
this
when I
wasn't
really realized the need to do some sports psych on myself.
Yeah, but what's interesting is this wasn't your first meet, right? These weren't the first three throws that you had taken. So it was, something that you were comfortable with that then you realized, later on that maybe some of these mental skills weren't quite up to the speed they needed to be. And that's something that I hear all the time. I talk to parents and they say this would have been great if I had it, when I was in high school. But it comes with like that level of maturity to then recognize maybe that it's the mental side of things that are, that are tripping you up. So,
Well, in
absolutely.
that case, it clearly was I wasn't ready for the moment. I wasn't ready for the anxiety levels that I experienced. And so from that point on, literally every day, composure and breathing exercises became a part of my everyday routine going into every practice, for sure, every throwing practice that I had. But even in terms of lifting, getting into a pre-lift routine where I could control my anxiety, control my focus, adjust my arousal level, which was certainly higher for lifting competitions than it was for throwing competitions. But I mean, it became something that I was mindful of from that point on, every day of training, every opportunity that I competed.
Yeah. So it sounds like you made the kind of connection on your own between your psychology training and your, your experience as an athlete. What was the kind of state of the field of sports psychology at the time? Was it something that maybe you had access to or that, was still a kind of emergent field?
I mean, during the years that I was training and competing, so I graduated with my PhD in 77 or 76. I was licensed in 77. Um, the last time that I had trained was 1966, or I'm sorry, 69 after my undergraduate degree, and then after a master's. And then I worked for several years, didn't train at all, and then kind of got the bug and began training again physically in terms of lifting, throwing a little bit, regaining strength. I made when I was an undergraduate. At that point, I was around 6'3". I weighed maybe 240, 245. I was relatively strong. When I came back in the late 1970s into the early 1980s, um, I was bigger, I was stronger, I was smarter, especially after that first experience of failing. And I personally and painfully understood the need for mental preparation as part of my routine.
Yeah. So where did you get some of the ideas for the things that you had said? You had mentioned kind of the deep breathing, the relaxation, the arousal control. Was that like did you have a coach or a mentor that kind of pushed you in that direction, or were you looking at the psychology of things and kind of applying topics that you knew would work?
I think it was more knowing some of the skills that I had for whatever reason, early in, actually, as I was finishing my PhD program, had an interest in specific mental skills like hypnosis.
Mm,
Fortunately for me, the Department of Psychiatry at Ohio State University had a fairly noted professor, a guy named Dr. Peter Gwynn at that time, who was very much into um, learning and being trained in and utilizing hypnosis as a therapeutic tool. And I mean, hypnosis, in my mind, especially after I went through the training, it became clear to me that there was very little separating hypnosis from intensive muscle relaxation, intensive breathing exercises, and basically learning how to self manage yourself in a competitive situation, whether it was, physically competitive or intellectually competitive. And so those were that was the training I took into starting to apply these things to myself in the early 1980s. And then later on, when I finished competing because of an injury, probably it was a good thing because I don't know that I would have been able to stop myself on my own at that point.
Sure.
Um, um, Became interested more in the applied aspects, and really my introduction to that world began in 1989, 1990. Specifically, the first competition that I went to as a sports psychologist was the 1990 Goodwill Games in Seattle, Washington. Um, and That was when I became involved with what ended up being the USA Track and Field Sports Psychology Group. Dr. Rick McGuire was the head of that group. He was a former track coach for probably 30 some years at the University of Missouri, but also had a PhD in sports psychology. And Most of the people who were involved in that group at that time were trained in academic sports psychology. My situation was a little bit different and unique in that group, in that my training was really in counseling psychology, and I had a PhD in counseling psychology and had worked and was licensed as a counseling psychologist, and then began to apply those skills that I had used working with trauma patients, which was the primary focus of my clinical practice, and applying it to sport and performance psychology situations. I mean, the
Yeah.
first time I really did that was at the Goodwill Games in 1990. And from that point on, I was very involved with USA Track and Field in general, and especially with the throws group, which I had been a member of as an athlete. And I think that certainly gave me a lot of credibility with those athletes, um, because they knew me as a fellow thrower, as a discus thrower. They didn't even know that I had a PhD in psychology. They didn't know that I was interested in sports psychology. But they knew that I knew how to throw the discus and I knew how to compete. And I had competed with and against many of those people over the course of the previous 4, 5, 6 years. So I started working with a throws group, and almost by just sheer fortune, I was the sports psychologist for the 1991 um, national championship meet. I was a sports psychologist. My first like major sports psychology position was as a sports psychologist for the world championship team in Stuttgart, Germany.
Mm.
That was in 1994. That was after the Dan and Dave disaster at the 92 Olympic trials. I started working with Dan O'Brien later in 92. And then from 93 on, I worked with Dan and the entire decathlon group very closely, as well as working with the throwers.
Hmm. Yeah, I appreciate you kind of giving us some background there. I think it's really interesting your kind of independently creating a lot of the skills that we talk about today, right? You did it out of necessity to help yourself perform, whereas a lot of us nowadays we have to rely on the research and p-values and all that type of stuff to see if these techniques are effective. But for you, it's like a trial and error. Did this help me? Did this not help me? Which I think gives you again, you mentioned it, the athlete connection, right? They connected with you because they knew it worked for you, and that's how they knew you. So you were able to get that buy-in a lot earlier, and I think that
Right.
that contributed.
I mean, those are obviously not conversations we had when I was still a thrower because I'm competing with them or against them.
Sure.
But later, when I was working with some of those same throwers or working with the decathletes, I drew on my own experience. I talked about the fact that, in 81 when I went um, the Olympic festival, I wasn't ready. I thought I was ready. I was probably physically ready, but I wasn't ready psychologically to perform in that type of setting. And so, like I said, starting after that experience, I went to the Olympic festival, which at that point was a fairly big meet. It was a competition that they held for about 10 years from 1981 through I think the early 1990s. And what they did was they uh, separated the country into four different regions, north, south, east, and west. And then and then the two most highly ranked throwers in each of those regions was selected to compete for that region at what they called the U.S. Olympic Festival.
Huh.
It was in Indianapolis at the track and field facility at IUPUI, which you've been around many times from swim meets.
Hmm.
Um, and then it was also at Colorado Springs at the Olympic Training Center several times.
Okay.
Um, so those were, the Olympic festivals in 82 and 83, the Olympic trials in 84, and then some national competitions in 85 and 86 before I got hurt. That was really my focus. In 87, I think I was honestly mourning the lack of ability to be involved anymore in those as an athlete.
Right.
In 88, 89, that's when I became aware of the USA track and field group, and things kind of went from there.
Okay. And so it sounds like there was some pre-existing sports psychology infrastructure, but it's more team by team basis. There wasn't really an overarching access to the services for you guys at that time.
No, I mean at that point, and for what it's worth, the USA track and field system program that Rick McGuire, myself, and seven, eight, nine other sports psych professionals um, um, became involved in, and Rick really was the architect of that program. I mean, that really became the model program for all the national governing bodies for Olympic sports
Mm,
in the United States and really in the world.
yeah. Yeah, it's tremendous because it's definitely exploded since then. Now the Olympic Committee has psychology services department with many
Right.
many people involved. So it sounds like you were kind of the blueprint for what's going on nowadays. But you've worked with Olympic athletes here early on in your career, and then you've gone on to work with professional athletes. Are there any common maybe traits or skills that you've noticed across these elite athletes, these high performing athletes?
Um, they all obviously are incredibly gifted physically. I mean, these are the 99.99 percentile people.
Mm,
And you have to have that level of physical ability. But the reality is, um, for example, with regard to the Olympic Games, there are in any given event 30, 40 athletes from all over the world who compete
hmm
and three medal. Uh, and um, and the differences between those who medal and those who don't, between those who make an Olympic final or a national championship final and those who don't, oftentimes is what occurs in between their ears during those moments of competition and what kind of preparation they have devoted to mental skills during the course of their physical training.
Yeah, and I think what you said there is important too, that it's not the mental skills don't just show up on competition day, right? They show up every day in training, getting you through tough moments in practice, making sure that you're not burning out every day, making sure that your focus stays there. So it does help that those moments of performance, right, being on the Olympic stage, but it also helps when, no one's watching and you're just training kind of in the darkness of sport. So um,
Right.
I appreciate you kind of shedding some light on both sides of that. Um, were there any athletes that you worked with that you had, particular breakout moments with when you're working in these these elite athletes and their specific venues?
I mean, there were numerous athletes that I was fortunate enough, privileged enough to work with. Probably the best known athlete that I worked with, at least with regard to track and field, was Dan O'Brien. And I think you've met Dan, and he has given me permission to discuss the work that we did together. So I'm not telling any tales out of school. And he was both the most gifted, physically gifted athlete that I have ever worked with, and really in many ways the most psychologically gifted, but also the most psychologically cursed,
Mm,
in the sense that um, he prior to the 92 Olympic trials, he had just come on the scene. Actually, his first major international competition was that Goodwill Games that I had first was my first sports psych introduction
hmm
in Seattle, Washington in 1990. In that competition, I think he finished either second or third behind another American, Dave Johnson, who was also a great decathlete. This is in 1990. In 1991, at the World or at the National Championships in New York, Dan set an American record in the decathlon in 1992 at the trials. That is where he failed all three attempts in the pole vault. And it wasn't, I mean, again, this is indeed the world's greatest athlete. And yet he was unable to clear a bar that was his starting height every day in practice. To me, the most dramatic and clear-cut example of how psychological dynamics and anxiety and fear and all of those psychological factors can literally can outweigh even the ability of the world's greatest athlete.
yeah.
And so we started working together in 92 after the trials. We worked together in 93, in 1994 at the World Championships in Stuttgart, Germany, 1995 at the World Championships in Göteborg, Sweden, and then obviously in 1996 at the US Olympic trials and at the Olympic Games, which were in Atlanta. I mean, the clearly everybody knew that the moment of highest anticipation, the moment of highest drama at those Olympic trials was going to be Dan O'Brien's first attempt in the pole vault
Mm,
at those trials. And so, without realizing on his part that we were working on it, when I started working with him in 92 and 93, um, we would at that point I could still throw a little bit, and so I would work with him not only in terms of sports psych skills in the throws and the jumps and the sprints, but also in terms of a little bit of his technique, at least specifically with regard to the discus throw.
mm,
And and again, I emphasized the importance of doing breathing exercises, learning composure skills. Um, we emphasized that in every competition. The third attempt in every event was going to be the most important, whether it's high jump, whether it's long jump, whether it's shot put, discus, javelin. Um, um, that was the focus, being ready to perform your best when it counted the most.
Mm,
And again, this was without ever having one word of conversation about what happened in the 92 Olympic trials. Um, no conversation about it, just working on things that did not raise anxiety levels, but did present opportunities to build skills. And the first conversation that we ever had in 3 years about what happened at the Olympic trials in 92 and what was going to happen at the Olympic trials in 96 in Atlanta was in November of 1995, about 6 months before the actual Olympic trials and 3.5 years after I started working with Dan.
wow. Yeah, it must have been hard to not address that, as the elephant in the room, because I feel like there would be a lot of pressure to address it. But I think your approach to kind of build the skills around it, to then once you get to that place, you already have all of those skills, all the composure and regulation skills built in. So then when you do attack, that elephant in the room, then you know what to do. Um, I remember also kind of maybe an aside here, but one of the things that you had mentioned to him at some point was, when you start to feel that visceral anxiety, when you feel the butterflies in your stomach, that you should make them fly in formation, that you should make
Right.
them work for you. And that's something that's really stuck with me because I think that's one of the kind of the hallmarks of that fight or flight is people get that upset stomach. And when I've used that with athletes and said, make that work to your advantage, it makes sense because it's that adrenaline, it's that your body is preparing for a battle, right? You're preparing to attack, and so building those skills to then when that moment comes, when that third jump comes and all that anxiety starts bubbling up, learning how to use it, not necessarily diving into the root of a problem, but building the skills to overcome it. I think that's a huge testament to your approach to working with him.
Well, I mean, it was fortunate because in my clinical practice working with trauma patients, I was well aware that the last thing you want to do, especially early in treatment, is take them back to the worst moment of their life,
Right,
take them back to the trauma because, when they're not prepared to deal with that, all you're doing is re-traumatizing them.
right.
And that's what would have been the case with Dan. In the meantime, um, every situation that came up, we talked about, having the ability to know that you were going to have your best when it counted the most. That the like I had said to you, you were going to be able to get the butterflies to fly in formation so that you could make all of that arousal and potentially debilitating anxiety instead work for you and raise the level of your performance. But I can tell you, the first time that we looked at that videotape from the 92 trials, literally, um, we were at a camp in Tempe, Arizona, um, and he and I had a meeting scheduled. I brought the tape with me. We went into the meeting, we talked a little bit, and I said, Dan, there's something I want you to watch. And so we sat there and I put the video from the pole vault in 92 trials on, and literally I think you could hear a pin drop in the room.
Mm,
And after it was done playing, I think we sat there for probably 2 or 3 minutes. It felt like 20 or 30 minutes, and neither of us said a word. And he's still watching the screen, even though nothing's happening, and I'm watching him. And
Hmm.
it's clear that he is in a dissociated state. He is back in that moment. And at that point, I said, I just want you to breathe nice and deep and slow. Just do the kind of breathing exercises that you've been doing for the last 2.5, 3 years. And then let's watch this again. And then let's talk about it. And
Hmm.
that's what we did.
Wow.
And, um, and, but we really, I wanted to make sure, I wanted to desensitize him to the point where there wasn't a snowball's chance in hell that what happened in 92 was going to happen. And so literally every day in practice, not, I mean, if you're a decathlete, you have certain days that you work on running, sprints, certain days you work on hurdles, certain days you work on jumps, certain days you work on throws. Usually you'll do at least one or two of those different things in any given training session.
Hmm.
Well, on the days that he was going to work on the discus, or work on the shot, or work on the pole vault, um, his coach, Rick Sloan, literally before the pole vault training session, took him into a room, put the training, put the video of 92 on, talked with him about it, talked with him about everything he had learned since then, so that by the time we got to the trials, it was it was just a non-event. Now, the interesting thing was this: there was a Grand Prix meet in Atlanta in May. The games were late June and July. In May, there was a Grand Prix meet in Atlanta in the same stadium that he would be competing in the trials.
Oh,
And,
wow.
and so again, what we used that for was this is your rehearsal.
Hmm.
This is you have you this is you being in the same stadium, competing with the same people, same sights, sounds, smells, everything the same.
Yeah.
Same area where you're going to warm up as you'll warm up in the games. And so we literally made that competition a dress rehearsal. And the irony of it was this, that during that competition, um, when Dan got on the runway for his first attempt in the pole vault, this is in May,
Hmm.
they put on this gigantic scoreboard, which was right, I mean, literally right next to the runway, that end of the track and the runway for the pole vault. They put the video of his failure in 1992 on the
Wow.
screen.
Yeah.
And Rick Sloan, his coach, and I are both going nuts because we didn't ask him to do this.
Right.
Fortunately, we didn't ask them not to, you
Yeah.
know.
Sure.
Uh, but as it turns out, um, his first throw was really good, and his second was better, and his third was his longest throw.
Yeah.
And afterwards, we talked to him and we said, "Did you see what they put on the scoreboard when you got up for your first vault?" And he said, no. He said, I was locked in. He said,
Wow.
all I saw was the runway and the box, which is where the pole vaulter plants the pole before
Sure.
they take off. And
Wow.
so, I mean, at that point, the games were almost an afterthought.
Yeah.
Although, ironically, even in the games, not in the pole vault. In the pole vault, he did fine. In fact, I think he was either second or third, although the places don't matter. It's the height that you clear and the points that you earn.
Hmm.
But by that time, by the time pole vault is the eighth event, javelin throw is the ninth, 1,500 meters, which was Dan's weakest event, is the 10th event. Going into the javelin, there was a young German decathlete, guy named Frank Bussmann, who literally had 8 out of 10 lifetime personal bests in almost every event at that Olympic Games. He
Wow.
he he wasn't even in anybody's picture in terms of even making the final, never mind medaling. And
Hmm.
here he was leading the decathlon after 8 events.
Hmm.
And he was relatively weak in the javelin throw. I think his best was around 60 meters, which is 197, 198 feet. At that point, Dan's best lifetime best throw was about 63 meters. Um, Dan uh, Busman was in the first group. Dan was in the second group because he had been in the pole vault longer.
Hmm.
So going into the javelin, we kind of knew what we hoped he needed to do because he needed to have a lead going into the 1500 meters because he wasn't going to be able to stay with Busman in the 1500 meters.
Hmm.
So his first throw, 62, 63 meters, pretty close to his lifetime best. Second throw was a lifetime best, I think 63 meters, 60 close to 64 meters. It was good. It gave him the lead in the overall score, but it wasn't going to be enough to give him the space he needed from Frank Buseman.
Hmm.
So here's Dan. It comes down to the third throw in the javelin. And I still remember he actually came over to the stands where I was,
Hmm.
not to talk to me, but Dave Johnson, who was a great decathlete but had not made the Olympic team because of injury in '96. He asked him which of two javelins should he use for the last throw, and Dave
Hmm.
told him to take javelins are rated for different distances, and if you take a javelin that's rated for a longer distance, but you aren't able to kind of throw through the point of the javelin,
Hmm.
it's going to go less distance rather than more.
Sure.
Anyway, he told Dan to take this certain Sandvik javelin.
Hmm.
Dan goes to the end of the runway, comes down the runway, plants his foot. The javelin flies out of his hand. You could tell at that point. You couldn't tell exactly what it was going to be, but you knew it was going to be a really far throw. And it
Yeah.
ends up, he threw over 67 meters, which is
Wow.
literally a lifetime best in the Olympic Games on his third attempt. 4 meter difference in terms of his lifetime best. That's 12 feet.
Yeah.
That's unheard of. And even more importantly, the amount of points that throw gained him in the javelin put him so far ahead that all he had to do was keep Frank Buseman in sight in order to know he was going to win the Olympic Games.
Wow. I think that's really impressive that you were able to get him to a place that he was able to overcome some of those unforeseen obstacles, right? Like the putting your biggest failure up on the screen right before you're about to perform, or somebody coming from the back of the pack to surprise everybody. A lot of times those are the things in my experience that throw athletes off, right? We can prepare for what we think is going to happen, but then when something that we didn't expect comes up, that's what throws us off our game. So, the work that you did with Dan on, the skills in order to be able to handle any unforeseen circumstance, right? No matter what happens, I'm able to stay, in my zone, in my flow state, and perform at my best. So, the question I guess I have, in your work with Dan or in your work with all the athletes that you've worked with, is there one mental skill that really sticks out as kind of like the mental skill that you want all athletes to have?
Um, I mean, I think there are several, but if I had to pick one to encourage people to work on, um, obviously, if you have horrible negative self-talk, it's going to be you're handicapping yourself. You're sabotaging yourself. So you have to have you have to have goals, you have to have positive self-talk, you have to have the ability to utilize kind of solution focused self talk
Mm,
rather than problem focused self talk. But at the end of the day, I think you have to be able to maintain composure and focus on what you're doing if you're going to bring your best to bear in the biggest situations.
mm,
And so I would, and I think that it is it is the skill that is the easiest to kind of take for granted because the reality is in training situations, it is you can't replicate, you know, an Olympic Games final. You can't replicate coming down to the third jump or the third throw,
mm,
but you can work on replicating it. You can practice it. You can put yourself in situations where you distract yourself and expose yourself to, for example, the kind of negative and failure experience that Dan had in 92
mm.
to the point where, and then you can, in practice, get yourself, um, to replicate that. I mean, for example, his coach Rick Sloan came up with this idea. He got photography classes to come out during vault training sessions,
Mm,
and there would be 15 or 20 kids from a photography class that were in a circle around the pole vault pit well,
mm,
Dan taking Dan's picture while he is practicing vaulting.
yeah,
And so, I mean, I mean, we went to extreme lengths, and just because I wanted to not leave any stone unturned in terms of him knowing that he was prepared for that moment. What we didn't realize is that that moment was going to occur in the javelin throw, not in the pole vault.
sure. Well, and that kind of reminds me too about when you were working with the Jets and we'd go to those training camps and see the teams working out. They would play the loudspeakers so loud that the players couldn't communicate to test that or to stress test their ability to talk and communicate, at like a Super Bowl or at a big game where they couldn't hear over the crowd. So,
Right.
kind of stress testing your ability to handle those specific environments, I think is really helpful. But yeah, I absolutely think that without the arousal control, right, keeping yourself composed, everything else kind of flies out the window. I know I've been in situations where you're just too, you're too kind of geeked up and all your other skills are inaccessible in that moment because you're just
Right.
so overwhelmed by the moment. So finding those skills to bring yourself back down and then to express the skills that you've worked on kind of behind that as well. That's a great recommendation for athletes. Would you say that in all the athletes that you've worked with, that the more elite athletes tend to handle pressure differently than athletes that are, trying to reach that elite status?
I mean, obviously, if they are elite in terms of the people that they are competing with, on a day-to-day basis or on a regular basis, that obviously is an advantage. But at the
Mm,
highest levels, everybody's elite. Everybody's a 99.9 percentile physical specimen. And I think the difference that I have seen fairly consistently in elite level athletes is that they view pressure differently than individuals who are maybe not as elite or who have not been, done the mental skills training work.
mm,
I mean, the reality is you don't want to help an athlete prepare for the easiest moment of their life. You want to help them prepare for the most challenging moment of their
mm,
life. And so I think that elite athletes tend to view pressure as a challenge rather than as an obstacle.
yeah.
And hopefully it's a challenge that they've prepared for, that they've developed skills for, and that really brings out the best for them. The
Hmm.
adrenaline works for them instead of working against them.
Yeah. I think that's something that I've noticed in my own working with athletes. I think I used to try to alleviate that pressure by, giving them perspective and kind of broadening the scope. But now I think I've learned more that the pressure should be used, right? And I really like the sentiment that pressure is a privilege, right?
Right.
A lot of people want to be in those situations. How many kids want to be an Olympic athlete, and then here you are, actually an Olympic athlete, and it's a privilege to be in the position that you're at, or for me at NCAA's, or for anyone at high school championships, that moment is something that had to be earned, and then it should be treated as something that you earned rather than something that you have to avoid. So um, I definitely appreciate that reframing of the idea of pressure. Do you think there's any kind of small daily habit that athletes could do to help that kind of emotional control, or that staying a little bit more steady in those high stress situations?
I mean, I think that um, incorporating different skills into their kind of psychological armamentarium is what's important. Knowing or believing that when you get to a quote unquote high pressure situation, that you're going to be okay. You're going to be fine. In fact, it's going to bring the best out of you. I mean, I jokingly say the easiest way not to have to deal with pressure is don't be very good. If you're not very good, you'll never have to deal with pressure.
Yeah,
People who are average in performance situations typically don't have a lot of pressure on them.
yeah.
They also don't have the kind of joy that comes with preparing for those highest pressure moments and then succeeding in them.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's that idea that you earned that moment, right? You worked hard, you performed, you competed, and you earned that pressure. If you haven't
Right,
earned it, then you don't feel the pressure. So I
right.
appreciate that sentiment a lot. Um, with these elite athletes, we talk about performance being the end goal, right? But in, our work with athletes, we treat them as a person. We treat them, not just as a horse that is to be, for performance sake. What is your experience with kind of when the lights fade after those big performances, after the Olympics, or after a Stanley Cup? What does that tend to be like, from more of the human side of an athlete?
I mean, I think that the key is finding the next thing that is meaningful for you.
Hmm.
And for a lot of athletes, that next thing is taking what they learned, taking their successes and failures, and helping others. Whether it's as a coach, whether it's as a mentor, whatever that role is, having others be able to benefit from your experience, from your knowledge, from your skills, and and know that or believe that when they get to that highest pressure situation, that's what they prepared for. Um, um, and whatever, I mean, the reality is that can be something for every athlete at every level, whether it's making the districts in swimming, whether it's qualifying for the state meet, whether it is, either making the championship final or the console final at a state championship,
Hmm.
whether it is as a college athlete competing in your conference, and then knowing that you are competing for to win your event or to place high in your event, to qualify for the NCAA's or whatever goal you and your coach have set.
Hmm.
That's what I mean. Really is I think it's an important life skill to learn, and then taking the things that you've learned and going from having them as a trait, the trait of being able to relax under pressure, to not just I can relax, but I am relaxed.
Mm,
It's taking it from just a trait or a skill that they have to a lifestyle. Because what we know from non-athletic stress studies is that when you're in a high state of stress, it taxes your system, it taxes your body, it taxes your mind, and it takes a toll. And when you learn to relax, and then when you learn to be more relaxed and to be more composed and to live your life that way, you're probably adding days, weeks, months to your life.
yeah,
And certainly
absolutely.
you're adding quality to it.
Right, and we know that just based on neurochemistry, right? Elevated cortisol over a long period of time is really disastrous for the body. So, yeah, I think one of the things that I emphasize with athletes is these skills are not they don't exist just in sport.
Right,
So being someone who is a great teammate or communicates very well or handles a stressful situation well, these are things that transfer into your life and really do set you up to succeed, right? So if you've competed at a at a high school championship meet, you're going to be much more comfortable sitting in an interview than somebody who's never been there. So transferring those skills, I think, is hugely important. And then also you kind of touched on the identity piece where you want to internalize these skills. So just like we internalize the athlete identity, you're not somebody who does sports, right? You're an athlete.
right,
You're not somebody who practices mental skills, but you are a very mentally skilled athlete, right? So it's
right,
making that part of who you are and taking that into the next stage of life. I think is phenomenal advice, and I think the athletes that I have seen struggle with retirement are the athletes that have not transferred their skills into the next thing. They're kind of starting at zero in their next pursuit rather than starting already ahead because of their sports.
right. And I mean, sometimes that's a double-edged sword
Sure.
because, having the identity of being a championship swimmer, for example, or a championship thrower, um, it's a good thing if that identity transfers to how you feel about yourself in an overall sense.
Mm,
But if all you are is a high level swimmer, what do you do when when your life isn't focused around swimming?
right.
I mean, you can transfer those skills and those abilities to other areas, but if you struggle to do that, if your identity is so stuck as an athlete or as a swimmer, you're going to make life down the road a lot harder for yourself than it has to be.
Sure. I mean, you see that a lot with like the NFL players who retire and don't have anything, to either fall back on or to look forward to. So athletes are very goal-oriented people. We want something to be striving for. And so your allusion there to setting kind of the next goal, I think, is important. And then transferring that athletic identity into something positive, I think is great. Um, is there, looking back over your career, is there kind of one piece of advice that you have gleaned or that you really believe it to be true from your work in all these different venues?
I mean, I think that one of the things that I try and do is look at things in terms of the process rather than the outcomes. Look at what I want to do instead of how I'm doing.
Hmm.
Because the reality is, if you are someone that takes on challenges, um, it's not going to be the same. If your whole life has been wrapped up in being a swimmer or a thrower, if you can't find some area of your life to transfer that focus to and that desire to, you're going to struggle to find meaning going forward in your life. Um, there were moments from when I was a competitive athlete that I know I will never experience in any other part of my life.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that I can't experience things that are just as significant in their own realm as, going to the Olympic trials or, competing at a track meet in Knoxville, Tennessee with 7 out of the top 10 throwers in the world being the other 7 guys in that field. You know,
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, the
Yeah.
reality is sport provides opportunities like that that life just doesn't provide.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean that life doesn't provide challenges and that life doesn't, can't be interesting in a different kind of way.
Hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's, that's really important. And also, I know I've always liked to say that sports is a microcosm of life. It might not provide the same exact experiences, but it provides examples or less risky instantiations of things that then happen in your life, right? So losing a big we lost our high school conference swim meet by half a point when I was a sophomore, and that was devastating, when it happened, right? But it is holds nothing to losing a relative or a family member or something like that. So it's kind of a safe way to experience things that then sets you well up to kind of address the rest of your life. Um, Absolutely, I think that's one of the big benefits of sport for everybody. Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
you're never going to always be the best.
sure.
But that doesn't mean you can't be the best that you can be, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of in closing here, one of the last questions I have for you. You've worked with elite athletes across a lot of different sports. Have there been any, particular things that you've noticed between sports? Are particular skills more necessary in certain types of sport? Team versus individual, or something like that, where you're competing up by yourself versus having a group behind you, or anything like that that you've noticed?
I mean, I think that there obviously, if you're in an individual sport, you have no one to rely on but yourself. You have no one to blame but yourself.
Mm.
In a team sport, it becomes there's more variables, there's less control, and
Hmm.
so sometimes the skill is still being able to focus on what your job is rather than focus on the things that you don't have control over. You don't have any control if you're on a basketball team. You don't have any control over a turnover that someone else creates. You can get frustrated about it. You can, be a bad teammate, give them a sour look, or you can, try and lift them up and refocus them.
Mm.
So you can take some of these same skills and you can transfer them to your interaction with your teammates.
Mm.
And I think at the end of the day, it's that kind of thing that makes great teams, is that they're there to lift their teammates up when things are tough, and then they're there to enjoy the moment
Hmm.
when things are good. you
Yeah.
know, and but still understand. It was kind of like, um, the Panthers in Florida Panthers hockey team in 23 um, lost in the Stanley Cup. But they learned something. They learned some things they needed to learn to be in a different place in 24 when it came to the Stanley Cup championships versus the conference championships.
Hmm.
And they learned something more in 24 when they won the Stanley Cup, that carried them over into 2025 when they again won the Stanley Cup. I'm sure they have had some of these conversations already. They're still enjoying the moment. Okay. I mean, it was 4 days ago or so,
Sure.
3 days ago, when they won the Stanley Cup for the second straight time, which is an incredible accomplishment.
Yeah.
But I promise you that they have already thought about a three-peat,
Mm.
because, winning back-to-back championships is extremely unusual. Winning the Stanley Cup 3 years in a row is, I mean, it's legendary.
Yeah, and it's certainly not something they were thinking about in 22 when they, won their Eastern Conference.
No,
Yeah.
no. I mean, at that point, winning that Eastern Conference championship, actually winning the, whatever, I can't think of the name of the award, having the most points in the regular season was a huge accomplishment for
Hmm.
them. And so when they went into the Stanley Cup championships, and I believe they either lost in the first or second round, certainly they lost much earlier than they wanted to. They still built on that to get to the conference championship the next year, win it, and lose in the Stanley Cup championship, and then win the Stanley Cup the last 2 years.
Yeah,
I mean, you either are going to learn from and profit from your experiences, or you're going to keep repeating them.
sure.
And I'm sure their focus right now is not to repeat them, but well, to repeat what they've done the last 2 years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and with that comes all sorts of new pressure, right? Like the
Right.
three-peat pressure, and now eyes are on them. They got the target on their back, so we'll see what they do. It'll be interesting to watch and see how they mentally engage with the next season.
Yep.
Uh, One of the things that I think I've gained the most from our conversation here is that there really is no like one size fits all model to this stuff. Your background is in counseling psychology, and it seems like you really go out of your way to meet the athlete where they are at. Not You're not coming in with an idea of you need to learn this, and this. You're speaking with the athlete, seeing where there are holes in their mindset, or maybe we're focusing on the wrong thing, and you're then providing those techniques and tools to supplement their already pretty elite mindset.
Right.
I think there's a lot of people in our field that come in and say, you need to change everything. We need to meditate every day. We need to do this. We need to do this. We need to like coming in with big long list of all the things you need to change. And I appreciate your perspective here, where it's like, they're already pretty elite athletes, and now it's just time to go in and make some small tweaks and make sure that it's a very individual experience for every athlete that you're working with.
Right. And the reality is, even if there's a bunch of things to change, you can only change them one at a time.
Yeah,
You know, you
absolutely.
can you can't change your self-talk while you're not being able to maintain composure. You
Mm,
can't change your composure when you have a bunch of negative self-talk. You have to take care of one situation, one circumstance, one skill deficit at a time. And then even then, you have to know that sometimes it's not going to be, sometimes you're going to run into somebody who has a little more ability, who
sure.
can bring the same skills to bear.
Yeah.
And the goal is being the best you that you can be.
Yeah. And the other thing is that you can't work on these skills when they're a problem, right? You can't
Right.
work on your self-talk when you're behind the blocks at the Olympics. These are things, as with your work with Dan, you work, in between those quadrennials. For 3 years you're working on
Right.
something. It's not a last minute, oh crap, I need to get on top of my anxiety, a week out. So these are trainable skills, and they need to be trained just like other, physical skills over a long period of time. And implemented then at the end during those championship moments. So,
Right.
um,
I mean, when you're in the middle of an oh crap moment, you're better off to pray than
right. And you wouldn't want to learn,
than to think about the mental skills you don't have.
yeah. I mean, you wouldn't try a new skill like in gymnastics that you'd never tried before, right? Or
Right.
when, so you can't take these skills like at the last second. So, um, I've appreciated that. Is there anything else that you wanted to leave us with before we do our mental fitness challenge?
The only thing I would say is if I could gift people a mindset shift,
Yeah.
the shift would be process, process, process.
Yeah.
Stick with the process, learn the skills, succeed, fail, learn from your failures, celebrate your successes, and then just continue with the process.
Yeah, and I love that sentiment. I've come across this a few times with athletes that what you think your outcome now is actually just a part of the longer process. So, if you're thinking like high school state championships, right? That's the outcome that you're focused on. What is that going to be then when you're in college, right? It's just a stepping stone to whatever is next. So really, everything is process if you zoom out to that kind of that career perspective. So.
Right.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and I don't do sport. I try to stay in shape now, but I don't do sport. But every time I do legal consulting as part of my work, and every time I go to testify in a trial, you know what I'm doing when I'm sitting in the lobby of the courtroom waiting? I'm
Hmm.
breathing nice and deep and slow. I'm telling myself calm and relaxed, calm and focused. You know what I mean? I know the facts of the case, and I certainly know what my opinions are better than the other person does, better than the prosecutor or defense attorney.
Hmm.
It's just a matter of being able to bring that information to bear and being able to not get overcome by the moment.
Yeah. I think that's great, and I think you've given us a lot of tips and things to think about based on your very illustrious career here. That does lead us pretty well here into our mental fitness challenge, which the last podcast we challenged everybody to take kind of a mindfulness walk every day. That is to get outside, try to notice some things that you see and feel on that walk. We're gonna flip that idea on its head this week or this month. This we're gonna kind of post a challenge here to work on meditating for at least 5 to 10 minutes a day. This is kind of the opposite idea of getting outside of your mind. Now we're trying to really sit comfortably and think about what is going on inside of our mind. Some tips here. There's tons of ways to meditate and different techniques to meditate. My favorite is to utilize the image of a stream where every thought is a leaf drifting down the stream. And rather than latching on to any one thought, you just kind of visualize it drifting down the river. Um, as with any mindfulness or meditation, this is done best seated and sitting comfortably. Uh, Take a few minutes to just calm your breathing, focus on normal breathing, and then getting into that imagery of seeing your thoughts drift by as a river. That can be very helpful. Do you have any tips for people that are working on this meditation challenge this week?
I mean, I think you find what works for you. The key is work on breathing nice and deep and slow, and focusing on the process of breathing, not the outcome of breathing, and and let your mind slow down rather than have to keep up the pace that you do during most days on a day to day. Give yourself that 2, 3, 4 minute oasis. Um, don't be try work on the stay with the process rather than getting distracted when after the first 15 seconds your butt itches or something like that. You know
Sure.
what I mean? Either scratch it or mentally scratch it, but focus on breathing nice and deep and slow. Focus on calm and relaxed. Focus on being that leaf that's just floating down the stream, and whatever works for you, use it.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your insights today, and I'm sure our viewers appreciate everything that you recommend and that you've learned from your career. So I appreciate that, and thank you for your time.
Yep. Thank you, Ian. It's been a pleasure. You did a great job, and I appreciate the opportunity you've given me to share my experience.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. This has been the Mental Barbell. If today's conversation got you thinking, share it with a coach, teammate, or friend who's leveling up. For more tools, training, and support, head to thementalbarbell.com and connect with us. Until next time, train your mind, trust your work, and perform when it counts. Bye bye.